Hello, everyone. My name is Salwa Al-Gantri from ICTJ. I welcome you on the second day on the seminar on the International Comparative Experiences Seminar and Remembrance as a Guarantee of Non-Repetition. Yesterday was the first day. There were three panels. The first one about the role of archives and initiatives of remembrance as a guarantee of non-recurrence under the context of transitional justice. There was a guest, Liz Simfensko and Jack Crisento from the Committee for Remembrance in Philippines. The second session was about remembrance at the institutional level, what has been achieved, the challenges encountered, and in the session we had Narges Debish, the former director of the archive department in the committee in the TDC, Mr. Debish for the Committee for the Preservation of Personal Data, Romain Ledovin, the project officer within Swiss Peace. The last session was around efforts to for remembrance at the domestic level, what has been achieved so far. We had Nadia Ben Youssef, the head of advocacy in the Constitutional Center in New York, along with Mr. Lutfi Ben Younes, Lutfi Ben Youssef, her father, and Munia Ben Hamadi and Bushra Triki, podcast producers. Where were you on the 14th of January Intifaqa website? And we concluded the first day. Today we will have two panels. The first one about memory preservation initiatives at the international level, and the second one will focus on the future of memory preservation and the next steps. So we shall proceed with the fourth session, memory preservation initiatives at the international level. In this panel, we will have experts from different countries who will exchange the various strategies pursued in their context based on their institutional capacities and their cultural and historical specificities, and victims' requests on how to use the archives of TDC in order to develop and implement memory preservation initiatives. In this session, we will have as guest speakers Mrs. Piper Anderson from Create for Rikers Public Memory Project. I wonder whether our guest is available. And then we have Mariana Mans-Minetti, the Senior Policy Officer for Freedom of Information and Expression with the Open Society Justice Initiative, along with Virginie Ladiche, a Senior Expert in the International Center for Transitional Justice. Is Mrs. Piper available on the live streaming? It would be convenient to proceed with Mrs. Mariana Mans-Minetti.
Good morning. Should I am Mariana Mas. Should I start or should we wait for Piper?
Salwa, isn't it supposed to start at 8:30?
We're supposed to kickstart the presentations of the guest speakers at 2:30, and as we finished late yesterday and the abstract summary session that didn't take that much time, So we deemed it convenient to start with the guest speakers who are ready in order to have more time for discussions, because yesterday the possibility of having more discussions was not possible. So if Mariana is ready, we could start with Mrs. Mariana and then Virginie, pending the arrival of our first speaker, Piper Anderson.
Sure.
Sounds good.
By
can
all
start.
means, each speaker will be allotted 20 minutes as agreed previously. Mrs. Mariana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I want to start by thanking everyone, thanking ICTJ, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Development Program. It's a real honor to be here today, even if my presence is not physical. It's a real honor to be here, and especially to share this panel with such excellent experts. Today I was asked to talk about Truth Commission archives. As you have been discussing, archives are vital to the successful operation and outcome of transitional justice processes for facing systematic human rights violations, grand corruption, and transform the systems that enable and allow those. To do so, states use a variety of approaches: investigation and prosecution, truth-seeking activities, reparation initiatives, institutional reforms to the reduce the possibility that repression or conflict will recur. Every one of those processes relies on archives. Archives then have a decisive influence on places and people in the past, in the present, and in the future. In a few minutes, I will talk specifically about state-created truth commissions. However, I would like to address now all truth-telling spaces and institutions, because thanks to the very diverse shapes these have taken, is that there is such richness of experience and creative ways in which truth is being sought, and narrative from persecuted and discriminated against groups and communities have been told. In all these spaces of truth, archives are collected, retrieved, and managed, and new archives are being produced. These records come in various forms, from oral memory to paper documents, maps, audiovisual and electronic media, databases, and more recently, on open source formats. Records come from governmental bodies, particularly those coming from security and intelligence sectors, from the government, from other governments, from non-governmental and international organizations, from religious groups, business, banks, schools, hospitals, and morgues, copies of radio and television broadcasts, etc., etc. But which could be the impact of those archives for any of these truth-telling spaces and institutions? So let's go through some of those spaces of impact. Let's start with the most obvious one, which is truth-seeking. These spaces of truth-telling have the potential to respond to individuals and societies' right to know. That is, being informed of everything that has happened in connection with gross human rights violations. This is particularly relevant because the truth about what happened to certain groups, communities, or ethnicities who were persecuted by a regime tend to be silenced, trying to create some sort of public amnesia about what transpired. The records in this case have the capacity to be the evidence to break down that wall of silence. The fact that those records are preserved and protected are relevant for truth-telling in the present and also in the future. As new information and new issues might become public concerns in the future, these records might need to be revisited to reevaluate evidence and or to find answers to questions that haven't yet been. Another space of impact would be on investigations and prosecutions. It's basically the probative value of records. The demand for justice is met in a good part through investigations and prosecutions aimed at ensuring that individuals responsible for crimes are accountable for their actions. The probative value of archives refers evidence brought by the victims to prove or determine facts. Although testimonies are key in any truth-telling process, of course, records may help to prove matters more quickly and succinctly. The ideal is to have those two sources working together. Examples of how archives have been key for prosecuting efforts can be found all around the world. For instance, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia obtained documents from Serbian institutions which they use as evidence. Now, the tribunal records form an important archive of human rights violations, and the items that were used in public prosecution are now available online. Another area of impact that I would like to make reference to is institutional reform. Transitions and truth-telling processes require, or at least aim for, institutional profound reform of systems and relationships of power that allow for systematic violations and rampant corruption. Archives are relevant for institutional reform in order to help understanding the institutional and power mechanisms that allow for those systematic human rights violations and the grand corruption scheme. This helps in mapping out the laws, policies, arrangements, and practices that were not working according to democratic principles. So looking into the past and see what can be improved. But they also can help in designing the new checks and balances processes and overview spaces for securing non-recurrence. They are also very important for illustration or vetting processes. Along with these formal structural changes that we just made reference to, institutional reform may also involve assessing the conduct of individuals who were in position of authority in former regimes. Illustration processes are related to the process of vetting, which is in general terms evaluating an evaluation and examination process in order to eliminate abusive and corruptive officials through due procedure. Illustrations were very popular in Central and Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall came down as a measure barring officials and collaborators of a former regime from position of public influence in a country after a revolutionary change of government. Access to records are central for these processes. Key records used in vetting personnel are personal records, particularly government records and those of political parties. Last but not least, the last area of impact I would like to make reference to now are reparations. Adequate and effective and prompt remedy for gross human rights require reparations in the form of restitutions, compensations, and rehabilitation. Records are a basic need for this purpose. From land records and other local registry and maps might be particularly useful in verifying land ownership, to restore lost rights for which identity documents are key to establish the person's prior status, and of course, they are key to develop a compensation plan. An example of this last one was done here in the United States in response to prison camps where citizens of Japanese ancestry were interned during the Second World War. Starting in 1988, the government paid each individual compensation for their time that they spent. To help determine eligibility for compensation, the government used 1. The original cards that were maintained on each person sent to camp, 2. Lists compiled by Japanese American NGOs. So we have established that truth-telling spaces and institutions use and create archives, and we saw the types of impacts that those could have. I would like then to talk about some types of truth-telling institutions, the type of records they use and produce, as well as some of the examples of what is possible to do by using those archives. I will finish up by focusing on national state-created truth-telling commissions and some recommendation for the preservation, protection, and access of the records. So let's start with civil society or community-led truth-telling processes. These have been key throughout the history to tell the narratives that have been silenced by regime or by those that command power. They take many shapes and forms. I won't go in depth in this because I know that my co-panelist Piper Anderson might be making reference to some of these initiatives. But anyway, I wanted to just share with you a couple of examples from around the world of civil society or community-led truth-telling processes. The first one I will make reference to happened rather recently in Canada. There, for over a century, First Nation children, Indigenous children were taken away from their families and forced to attend Indian residential schools, operated by religious organizations and funded by the federal government. Many of these children were inadequately fed, inadequately educated and housed, and many of them were abused physically, emotionally, and sexually. All of these while their languages and cultural practices were prohibited. Many of our organizations and institutions, such as the Assembly of the First Nations, documented these violations and advocated, which ultimately led to compensation, truth-telling, healing, and public education actions. The records they kept were essential for moving forward any of those actions that are now being implemented at the federal level in that country. But most importantly, to tell a history of systematic violations that have been silenced for over a century. Even the creation of a registry of the names of the children that never returned home allow for the appropriate ceremonies to honor them. Another relevant example comes from the Argentinian NGO Memoria Abierta. The records of this organization were used for the investigations against perpetrators of gross human rights violations. Those included recorded oral testimony, blueprints of destroyed buildings that have been used as detention and torture centers, witness statements. I even point out to where those centers were and the types of practices that happen in there, especially in terms of torture. Memoria Abierta's database and the archives that they had collected and created were key for assisting attorneys who took the cases and with finalizing making accountable many of the perpetrators. I will now move to another type of truth-telling spaces. I mentioned quickly before that security and intelligence records are central in truth-telling processes, particularly in the context where there was a repressive state or an armed conflict. The records from these institutions are key because not only they played a key role in the repression being the arm of the state or the people in power, but also because these institutions have a culture of keeping excellent records. So they tend to have a wealth of information in their archives. Of course, the access to those, it's tricky, but that's a whole other conversation. But what I would like to mention today is that there are some paradigmatic cases of security and or police records that not only were they were functional to truth commissions, but they became themselves a space of and a source of truth-telling. So let me give you two examples of these paradigmatic cases. The first one is the Stasi records. The Stasi was the East Germany secret police organization, and the records, many of which were destroyed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and reconstructed, became a cornerstone for the criminal investigation, truth-telling, and lustration processes in the country in order to secure that perpetrators wouldn't be part of the administration of the country. Of course, they were also key in the Nuremberg trials, but they also helped in establishing patterns and understand how the Soviet forces organized, acted, and responded in other former Soviet countries as the agency had been set up under the direct guidance of the Soviet secret police. These records are still open and available for consultation. The other example of security forces archives that become a source of truth-telling per se are the historical National Police archives in Guatemala. These records that were found by the Human Rights Ombudsman became the most valuable collection of records in the country about the state violence during the 70s and 80s. These records have been key for paradigmatic cases against the most senior military officials including for the first domestic conviction for genocide against the former head of state, Rios Montt. These records have been also used by families to search the enforced living here and by investigators, historians, and journalists to reconstruct the facts of one of the most painful times of the country. Last but not least, I will talk about the state-created truth commissions. I won't spend much time talking about the types of records that they have or the type of work that they do, because you have been discussing this throughout the conference. So instead of talking about that, what I would like to do is just focus on some recommendations about how to manage, preserve, and access those records because of the importance that they have for understanding the past, for facing the present, but mostly for preparing for the future. So we will just go directly into the recommendation, and if there are any other questions, I would be happy to respond to them. So to start with the recommendation, I will start by management of those records. Archives should ideally be under a specialized institution with a proper staff and storage requirements. This would also give the most professional level of management of the records, as well as a certain level of autonomy in their management. I understand that in Tunisia, hard copies of the archives are under the mandate of the National Archives, which is ideal. And I would hope that they also have digital copy of all of those archives, also with the National Archives, and of course with other institutions if they think that's the best way to move forward. Some of the records of truth commissions, of the Truth Commission archives might have to return, the originals might have to return to the owners, which could be NGOs, individuals, the private sector, etc. However, certified copies should be kept in the Truth Commission's archives in order to respect the integrity of the archive. This last recommendation takes time and specialized work, but it should be implemented even if it's in the medium term. And this is that there should be a proper technical description of the material of the Truth Commission held in the archival institution, because this is essential for researchers to have a meaningful access to it. Not only this, but also the archival institution must make that description public, whether electronically or on paper or both. I will move now to preservation, which is basically storage and security. The same requirements that apply to the preservation of archives in terms of storage in general also apply to the preservation of archives of truth commissions. There's not much difference there. So preservation requires the physical housing of the material, the staff to maintain the holdings, and the supplies for preservation. And of course, this comes with a price tag, which is normally not very discussed, but it's a reality. And those costs will depend on the climate, on the labor costs, and on the specialized skills available. And the other element of preservation is security. When managing Truth Commission records, because of the sensitivity of some of the records contained, protecting the records for intruders is a serious concern. The security conditions include: one, the physical placement of the records. So understanding if the infrastructure of the building that holds them allow for a special security condition of at least certain collections of the archive. In some cases, although this is not a requirement, but this is to be assessed is case to case if a vault might be needed. Second is the possible assignment of security personnel. Again, this depends on context and depends case by case, but depending on the content of the record and the threats that they might be under, there might be a need to assign security personnel. In doing so, assigning personnel, there must be a very good evaluation of who has the mandate or the capacity to do that, but also if the mandated or chosen institution to provide security is trustworthy, and if it does have any particular interest on those records. And number three is digital security. As there are very sensitive records, there could be intent to hack into the system to get rid of documents. there needs to be a solid security system and available staff that can manage that security system. Last but not least, I will talk about access. The access to Truth Commission archives would be in principle guided by the country's laws of archives, access to information, and personal data. For that reason, it's very important to review the laws that regulate all of those areas of the law in the country in order to see if they are in line with international standards and if they can really serve the purposes of truth-telling, fighting against impunity and non-recurrence. I understand that the access to information law in Tunisia is very good. It's one of the best in the continent. However, I understand that there are some challenges with the archives law, particularly in regards to the Article 15 and 16 that establishes long, decades-long secrecy around documents, with the exception of scientific research. So my recommendation would be to review this law, because these provisions could severely affect, in the case of the Truth Commission, archives could severely affect the kind of potential that these have that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation. And finally, so starting with the bigger legal.
Mariana, we cannot hear you. You are probably muted. Can you please check your connection and your device? You're probably muted. We cannot hear you.
It's on freeze.
Now the picture is on freeze. Could you please unmute yourself?
And we have the now. Can you hear me now?
I heard go along.
Can you hear me?
We now can hear you well. You can proceed.
Okay, thank you. I have like 1 minute left. So I was talking about creating levels of access to these records, the type of use to be done from the archive, from truth commissions, from state-created truth commissions. So I will just give you a few examples of categories that can be used. I will just give you a few examples, one of which is officers or employees that need this information to perform their official duties, which could be magistrate, prosecutor, judges, and ombudsman. Another category would be the persons seeking the defense of their own rights, so a victim of human rights violation during the former regime, and of course their lawyers. Then we would have another category of a named individual that looks for records on self. So basically people that are interested in the records that the former regime kept on themselves. Another category are former officials having access to records that they originated, reviewed, signed, or received while they were serving as an official of the entity. And last but not least would be the academicians, journalists, and the general public. For this last stage, there needs to be make a risk assessment, which Hopefully, it would be based on a 3-part test established by the Access to Information Law. But basically, the risk assessment needs to look at the public interest in disclosing that information, including considering if the disclosure could be a remedy per se towards society, but also looking at issues such as protecting the privacy, particularly when it contains sensitive information, etc. So I will leave it at there because I know I've taken all of my time now, but if there are any other further questions, comments, and suggestions, I would be happy to discuss those.
Thank you very much for your valuable presentation. If Piper Anderson is ready to give her presentation. Good morning, Piper Anderson from Create Forward and Rikers Public Memory Project. You are entitled to 20 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. And my name is Piper Anderson. I am the co-founder and one of the project leads for the Rikers Public Memory Project. I'm based in the United States, on the East Coast, just outside of New York City, which is where Rikers is right now. I've spent the last 2 decades working inside of US prisons with incarcerated people, using storytelling as a way to document the kind of state-sanctioned violence that exists within US prisons. The Rikers Public Memory Project, which was founded in 2017, is a Truth and Healing Commission and an independent body. We're not connected to any specific state entity or city entity. We're an independent group, community-led initiative that is a partnership with community organizers, with people who have been directly impacted by criminal legal policies in New York, and public memory practitioners and advocates for criminal justice reform. Our aim is to hold the city of New York and the state of New York accountable for the closure of Rikers Island, which is the last penal colony in the United States, and to end the state-sanctioned racialized violence that defines the criminal legal system in the US. Just to give you a little bit of background about Rikers Island. As I said, it's the last penal colony in the US, also one of the largest. The complex, which sits on 400 acres on a small island outside of New York City, has an operating budget of over $800 million. And that budget grows even as the population continues to shrink. Over 100,000 people will end up on the island each year, most of them Black people. 85% of the folks who are detained there have not been convicted of a crime and will spend months and sometimes years fighting for their freedom without having ever been convicted of a crime. Since its inception as a jail complex more than 100 years ago, 2 things have really remained true about Rikers. It is a violent place that disappears the poor, the mentally ill, anyone that the city and state wants to punish and criminalize. Second, that every effort to reform Rikers has failed since its inception. We've looked at hundreds of articles written about Rikers over the last century and a half. And again, there is this constant pattern of calls for reforms that ultimately land flat. And yet the island has continued to grow and grow and grow. There are now 9 jails on the island. More than about 6,000, 5,000 people funnel through there. At its height in the 90s, about 20,000 people were funneled through the island. The conditions are extremely inhumane. Many of the people that we have interviewed described would call it torture island. Young people would call it gladiator school. In addition to the violence often facilitated by correctional officers, the facilities are old and have not been repaired in years. They lack heat in the winter, proper ventilation in the summer. There have been cases of people detained there freezing to death or dying from heat exposure. Right now, in the midst of COVID-19, rates of infection have increased over 700%. There is a pandemic in and of itself just happening right on the island, and people are dying. So our work with the Rikers Public Memory Project is, one, to demand that the city close Rikers permanently. Right now, the city has made a commitment to closing Rikers by 2026 because of budgeting issues. They're now pushing that out to 2027. But one thing that community organizers have been able to secure is that Rikers, that a jail cannot be on Rikers after 2027 based on land use regulations now in the city. So the Rikers Memory Project has three components. The first is an oral history collection that includes 104 narratives of people who provide direct accounts of the kind of severe neglect and indifference to the most vulnerable, abuses against young people. There are 500 youth who are under the age of 21 right now on the island. Sexual assault, exploitation, and the use of violence to control detainees. So the narratives that we've collected are now going to live in a public archive that'll be accessible to the public and serve as an important part of New York City history. The narratives also provide us with the documentation that we need to make the case for a reparative justice, to make the case that the city must, one, address the harms that have happened there, ensure that they never happen again, but also that they be held to account for allowing a place like Rikers to exist for more than 100 years and cause generational trauma, cause the extraction of human capital, human resources from communities, the ripple effect of trauma that happens. Many people, when telling their stories about Rikers, would say that, even if you spent a day there, you are never the same, right? The trauma of being on Rikers, you carry it with you for the rest of your life. You take it back home into your family, into your community, and they feel it too. So there is a cumulative effect that it has. And so the oral histories will be in a public narrative, public archive. They'll be continue to be used by advocates to demand reforms to the criminal justice system in the city and the state. We also are building a public exhibition that helps to activate those stories and also the history of Rikers, because up until very recently, most people could not tell you where it was on a map. Most people did not know, even remotely, the kinds of things that were happening there and who was held there, or that most of the people who were being detained there had not even been convicted of a crime. In most places, that might be considered kidnapping, right? So the public exhibit will launch in 2022 and be used as a catalyst for public education and public dialogue throughout the city and eventually around the country. And then the last component is a public health initiative. Again, reparative justice is an important part of this work for us. We want to ensure that something like Rikers can never happen again. And also that the city is forced to reinvest in those communities that have been harmed. Throughout the city, you know, in the mapping that we've done, is particularly using the stories, but beyond that, in our research, we found that there are just a handful of neighborhoods, about 6 neighborhoods, that that are feeders for the island, right? Where people, specifically Black, Latinos, people of color, are the targets of this place. And so those particular neighborhoods need to be repaid for the harm that has been caused. And so the Public Health Initiative works to document this harm, document the kind of generational trauma. I should also say that in the oral history narratives we've collected, we found that there are families where, you know, there's been a father, a grandfather, and a son who have all been to Rikers Island, where going to Rikers Island in some ways can feel like a rites of passage. And so, you know, how do we address the harm that causes, the trauma that people are living with, and that has affected their lives and their communities? And so that is what we aim to do with that particular initiative. So I'm going to stop there, but the last thing I'll just say is that, you know, there are 3 things that we are constantly thinking about with this initiative. First is to remember, right? To remember Rikers. For many people, it did not exist for them until we began to share these narratives. Remember, repair, right? Repair the harm that has been caused. Restore relationship, restore agency, restore community. And so remember, repair, restore, things that we're constantly thinking about in our work, to ultimately upend a system of state-sanctioned violence that our country refuses to contend with. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your valuable presentation, and Mrs. Piper. We now give the floor to Virginie Ladish, Senior Expert at ICTJ. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Would it be possible to share my screen? If that could be activated? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, do you all see my screen or no? Okay. All right, thank you very much all for, first of all, for bringing us together. Thank you, Piper and Mariana, for those really fascinating presentations. Just technical check. I just want to see if now, sorry about that. Okay, can you all hear me and can you see the big screen, or are you seeing the little small presentations? I don't know if someone could speak.
We kind of see it, but it's a bit remote.
It's a bit remote, okay. One moment, please. This is the challenge of our new time. Well, I think perhaps oh, you could see the presentation in full. While I fix my technical issues, could I do one thing? Piper, would you mind? I wanted to ask you a question, if you would be willing to share just a little bit more about the process of community consultation and how you brought people together. It's something I want to cover in my presentation. So if you're willing to answer that very briefly while I figure out my screen, that would be wonderful. If not, I'll figure this out and we'll come to the questions in the Q&A. Apologies for this. Okay, well, let me just go ahead and let's see if I can get things set up again. Thank you again, everyone, for having me here today. What I want to talk about today is, so building a little bit on what Piper and Mariana just covered, is first to talk a little bit about what we understand as memory, memorials, and memorialization, because those words do cover quite a lot of different initiatives, different aims and goals. And I think some of those were already covered by both Mariana and Piper's presentations. I think they cover the full spectrum. But so just briefly to start, want to highlight, when we think of memory, I think most often what comes to mind for people is this idea of statues, monuments, and memorials. And oftentimes that comes with a more static representation of the past. Often what we are used to seeing, and now I'm just going to try this one more time. Often what we're used to seeing is these, grandiose manifestations of statues. So if you can see here in the presentation, okay, there. You can see here, there is a, on the left, we have the South Africa Rhodes Memorial, which is a statue built to Cecil Rhodes, one of the founders of the South African system of apartheid. And you can see it's this very grandiose statue on a hill, a man on a horse, overlooking the country. And, that's, I think, what is often associated with memorials when we talk about this notion. This concept, however, has been in recent years really challenged, exploded, and opened up. And you can see here on the right a very different type of monument and memorial. Rather than honoring the historic past, the male figure on the horse, this is actually honoring victims who were who suffered in the war in Peru. It's much more reflective, it's much more humble, and it's collective. And just a word about the Rhodes Memorial, you can see that, again, it was reflective of a certain national narrative of South Africa. And recently, actually, a group of students around Cape Town started a movement called Rhodes Must Fall, in which they focus on certain statues. But the protest around the statues wasn't just about the statues, but it was around dismantling the persistent forms of systemic racism that continue to exist even post the end of apartheid in South Africa. So I think the monuments have become a space both of honoring a heroic past, but then also a space of protest. And then in the right, and then these more sort of the types of monuments that we're often speaking about these days, something that's more about honoring victims and remembering also what we must never forget. So building on that idea, and Mariana mentioned a little bit the example of Argentina, where there was a military dictatorship for many years. What we see there is the way in which memorials can shift from places of performance of democracy they can become places of performance of democracy, not just the static representation of national identity. So what you see here is the former military school, which was a notorious torture center in Argentina. Many, many people went through its doors and suffered. And here at the top left photo, you see President Kirchner making sure that the photos of past dictators are removed before this center becomes opened up and now is a place where people can go visit, learn about the past of what happened. You can see a student group being given a presentation, learning about who was tortured, what happened, how, with the aim of not repeating again. And so I think this is a way of looking at memorialization, not to honor our heroes, not to affirm the world's realities, but rather to challenge them and to really help us move towards the realities that we want to see, not the ones that we necessarily do see. So there are different aims of memorialization. One, as shown in the example of the Peru memorial, my first slide, is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of victims, acknowledgement of what happened, a reckoning, especially if in the case of Argentina, for example, if people didn't know about what happened to the prisoners, if these were state secrets, having that come out in the open and having a recognition of what took place. The next is education. As we see in the photo with the center in Argentina, it's a common rhetoric. We must know our past to not repeat it, but I think it's a very important statement that has a lot of truth. And inevitably, all countries around the world don't sufficiently learn from the past and keep repeating it. So we really have a strong challenge to overcome that amnesia and make sure that we learn the lessons from the past. And I think, as was mentioned in many of the presentations yesterday, these aren't static lessons. They change over time. So as our own society and our own challenges evolve, we can take out different layers from the past and different understandings that might be relevant today that weren't before. Another important aim of memorialization efforts is advocacy, and I think that's something that the work that Piper just presented on the Rikers Memory Project is a perfect example of the way in which they're both working to acknowledge, educate, and then advocate for a change and for a closing of Rikers, and very importantly, also repairing the harm done and preventing the recurrence of such harms. So these, I think, are the aims that, whether we're talking about opening state archives, as Mariana talked a lot about, whether we're talking about building monuments or active spaces for engagement with the past, I think these aims can help guide the work in all contexts. Now, for the context of Tunisia, I just want to spend a little bit of time speaking about memory preservation work at the official level. As noted in other presentations, there's a lot of important work being done both at the official and at the civil society level in various countries across the world and in Tunisia itself. But of course, given the work of the IBD in Tunisia, archives of the Truth Commission is one of the topics that we're all interested in reflecting on today. So I think if we look around at past Truth Commissions around the world, there's a very mixed record over how the archives are managed. It's in some places, you know, there's no real plan. In other places, the archives are locked up for too long because of privacy laws. I think one place that we can look to for a really inspiring example is Canada. Mariana mentioned a little bit about the Indian Residential School legacy, so thank you. I don't need to go into that detail, but as she mentioned, you know, Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 5 years. It ended its work 5 years ago, and as part of its mandate, it was actually established in the settlement agreement that created, so the law that created the Truth Commission, that it had to create a follow-up body that would be a permanent repository for all of its archives, and a place also where people could continue to bring their testimony and their truth if they should wish. So the idea was, you know, even if the Truth Commission ends at a certain date, it doesn't mean that that we've captured all the stories that need to be told, that need to be archived. So what they did in Canada is they created the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation that's housed out of the University of Manitoba. And they have an agreement between the Truth Commission and the university that's also overseen by a governing circle of survivors, just to make sure that the mission of the National Truth and Reconciliation Research Center honors the best interests of the survivors while also prioritizing public education. So they have not only a database, multiple databases where you can search the archives of the Truth Commission. They have ongoing public education programs. They have, you will see here, so this is from the website of that National Research Center. It's been 5 years since the end of, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so they've just recently presented a report, not of the Truth Commission, but of the follow-up work to the Truth Commission. I think that's a first in my view. So they've just shared that, reflecting on what they've done to carry on the legacy of the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. Another example of their ongoing work is just marking the 5th anniversary of the end of the Truth Commission. They hosted a live discussion with the 3 commissioners of the TRC in Canada to reflect on 5 years since the end of the Truth Commission. Where are we? How are we doing with the calls to action that we have shared and presented? What more needs to be done? So I think this is one example of the ways in which we can put the archives of the Truth Commission to use, both for public and for private use. And if you can see at the top of the image, they also have a memorial where they have a roster of all the names of the victims that came forward for the Truth Commission, and they keep adding to it, again, noting that perhaps people weren't comfortable to come forward during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And therefore, you know, this is an ongoing process. So now, thinking about both official initiatives as well as civil society-led initiatives, one point that I think is really important to stress, or 2 points, is the first is the importance of community consultation in the design of any initiative. And importantly, that community needs to involve those that were affected. So survivors or victims, marginalized groups. And secondly, there needs to be a balance between symbolic and material. Sometimes we can think of the memorialization initiatives as something purely symbolic, and that might seem like an easier way out. All right, we'll build you a monument and then we're done. And that's not the case, and that's actually can be very counterproductive, as this one example I'll talk to you briefly about would show. So in Iraqi Kurdistan, there was this monument that was built to commemorate the victims of poison gas attacks by Saddam Hussein in 1988. This monument was built in 2003. And as you can see, there's this beautiful road leading you up to the monument, very grandiose. And this was a monument and a museum to these victims. However, this was built without any consultation. And so as you can see here in this quote, 2 things. Well, first, if you notice, the road leading to the monument is beautifully paved. This is a road in town full of potholes. You see that there's a lot of infrastructure needs that haven't been addressed. Actually, in 2006, people who were supposedly supposed to be represented by these by this monument were furious and launched a protest because they argued that rather than actually invest in their communities, the government had put a lot of money into this showy monument, which is where they would take all the international guests to visit that monument with that nicely paved road, so people got a good impression of their city, rather than taking them to the real communities to see the real realities. So as a result, in 2006, like I said, protesters burned down the museum because as you can see in this quote, they noted that local officials are making a lot of money from international organizations due to the tax on our town and pocketing that money. And we don't see a penny of that money. So I think this is a good warning story about undertaking any memory preservation or memorialization initiative without adequate consultation, excuse me, and with an imbalance between symbolic and material. So if you overemphasize the material of the symbolic at the expense of the material, it often will feel like an attempt to silence demands and not really honor the victims that need to be recognized. And now, just to wrap up, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about also the importance of civil society-led works, or sometimes we call it unofficial processes of remembrance and memory. So the example that Piper just gave from the Rikers Island Public Memory Project, I think, is an excellent example of what can be done at the community level unofficially, but that can also link to and push for official change. So as Piper noted, it's linked to the Close Rikers campaign. So it's started as something grassroots, but has connected advocacy aims that will lead to changes. I'll tell you briefly a little bit about a project that ICTJ was involved in together with the Voices of Memory Collective. It was really a bottom-up approach where we worked with a group of 9 women from Tunisia, intergenerational, some with more direct experience with the dictatorship and others less so, to reflect on what stories they felt needed to be told of the period of repression. What was their experience? And in particular, there was this notion, not much was discussed in the public realm of women who had suffered imprisonment. We knew a little bit more about the imprisonment of men, but not of women, or of the impact of the imprisonment of men on their family members. So this collective, with the support of ICTJ and the University of Birmingham, decided to take on a project that would sort of put these stories out there in different ways, with a book, with a podcast, a graphic novel, and then an exhibition. And the exhibition, I think, was the most public manifestation of this sharing of testimonies in a way that really sought to engage the public and be a space not only of remembrance, but also of a space of reflection for further action. So the exhibition was focused around the kofa, the basket that prisoners received and that family members brought to their loved ones who were incarcerated to bring food, clothing, secret messages. And what we found is that this basket was a way of unifying the different stories, and it includes multiple perspectives and multiple takes on one moment in Tunisia's history, but it's something that everyone can relate to. And we had artists interpret the women's testimonies and represent their stories in a multimedia art installation. And then we ended that with a reflection room, a space where we asked several questions and encouraged visitors to pause and think about what they had learned about their past and what that meant for their present and their future. So here you can see some school groups that came, and for many, it was the first time they were hearing these stories. They were shocked. Others were surprised to see the connections to ongoing problems in prisons today. And our hope was that this serves as a space of education that then eventually will lead to civic action. And for those who were involved from the Voices of Memory Collective, it's actually, here you have a quote from one of our members who noted that the exhibition is a kind of psychological symbolic reparation, not a material one, but it helped honor and give credit to the victims. And she noted also that that art is an important form of moving past perhaps debates and difficult topics to really focus on empathy, acknowledgement, and dignity. So just to wrap up, I want to close with a few thoughts about, again, memorials, memorialization, archiving. I think I'm using these terms a bit interchangeably. One is it should always be about a conversation. Again, moving past this static representation of a heroic past to really a conversation about what we can learn from our past and how does that affect what we want to do in the present and the future. Second, these must be consultative processes. Otherwise, they risk having perhaps the adverse effect to what you all are hoping for. And again, there's the example from Iraqi Kurdistan. And then I think linked to this idea of a consultative process is the idea that it should be rooted in helping to develop community, to help rebuild the community connections that were destroyed through the violations that are being looked at, to help solidify a community that will ensure that the past violations don't happen again. It's also important in terms of funding to see the funding sources, that they're varied enough or independent so that there can be a real debate and critical engagement with the past, not one narrative being put forward. And finally, as we think about taking on work in the realm of memorialization, just want to close a little bit with, again, link to the aims, what this work can achieve. Again, it can provide new information, and this new information with good educational engagement can help people come to new understandings and new realizations. And if it's done through a personal connection and interactive experience, this helps build empathy, awareness, and that can help create a new collective consciousness, a new responsibility towards others. If we don't know what happened to those around us, we don't understand why they're struggling, then we won't feel the need to develop programs to support them. Memorialization is also crucial in helping develop critical thinking, civic engagement, and in trusting in all of us the responsibility to defend the rights and values that we all hold dear and that are essential to creating a more just and equitable society. So with that, I'll end, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all guest speakers, Piper, Mariana, Virginie. Just before we move on to the questions, because Virginie raised the project of Voices of Memory that ICTJ had worked on in association with a group of 9 Tunisian women working on the ordeal of the Tunisian women. And in the 4 presentations mentioned by Virginie, Il Kef, Sfax, and Daif and Tunis, we were surprised that out of 1,600 people who visited the 4 exhibitions, 70% were below the age of 30 years. This is testament to the thirst of the young people to know what happened, how that happened, and why those abuses and violations happened, and to work on initiatives designed to ensure non-recurrence. Among the subjects we worked on within the project of Voices of Memory, bande dessinée, a cartoon, some cartoons referring to the process of the basket from the home to the prison, when the basket goes through the corridor of prisons. And this cartoon will be produced in the winter of 2021. It will be possible to download it on the electronic website of Voices of Memory project. So in the summer of 2013, we had 10 workshops with the youth clubs working with youth aged between 13 and 20 years, based on the content of that cartoon, talking and dealing with transitional justice, how to support the process, and how to reform the institutions to ensure non-recurrence, the significance of truth-seeking, and these were among the most successful workshops carried out by ICTJ in Tunisia. Recently, in October and November 2020, we conducted 3 workshops in association with youth organizations involving 50 or 60 participants. And in all of these 10 workshops, in 2019, 10 workshops, and 3 in 2020, we produced artistic creations through which the participants expressed their opinion and visions about the process of transitional justice, their perspectives, their future perspectives, especially in terms of non-recurrence. And we staged many exhibitions, and 3 exhibitions are due to be scheduled in 2021 regarding artistic production produced by youth in the last 3 workshops. I wonder whether there are questions from the audience online, on Facebook. No questions. So if there are questions from the conference room here.
Mr. Ahmed, you have the floor. Ahmed Karoud. Thank you very much. My question, sir, whether are you thinking about reorganizing the exhibition itself and organizing it in other cities apart from the 4 cities that you spoke about, especially if this exhibition has been very successful and had a great impact? So are you thinking about exhibiting it in other cities? Thank you very much. Any other question? With regard to this exhibition about the basket, indeed, we seriously thought about exhibiting it in other areas, and we indeed kept all the component elements which were handmade then, because we said maybe we'll have other opportunities outside Tunis and the Kef, Sfax, and Rdaïf, and I think that maybe it is high time we did that, especially as the transitional justice process has not been really activated and has been made operational. And we'd like to remind you that it is through these exhibitions we show what should not and must not occur again in Tunisia. Once again, I would like to tell you that with regard for these 4 exhibitions, the people who who monitored the guests when they came into the exhibition, and who explained the content and who explained the symbols of the exhibition were young people, and we actually did it on purpose. The ICTJ chose young people to do that job, especially in Rdaïf. Whoever worked on the organization of the exhibition, working in it, were young people from the very same region, namely Rdaïf, and it was a rich experience to make sure that there is a participatory role of the young people, and not only just coming in and visit the exhibition and then leaving it. This is for the ICTJ enabled us to come aware of the young people and to know the young people below 30 and to understand their suggestions, their vision with regard to the continuous violation of incessant violations. I don't know if you have any other question from the floor. Elodie, you have the floor. Thank you. It's rather a comment rather than a question. First of all, one of the presentation spoke about an old place which, of detention which has been transformed into memory centers, into a memory center. So it has become a sort of museum. Other people also work with civil society to organize several activities. So in fact, it's a place which is vivid, dynamic, alive, and which enables people to face their past, because some torture elements were preserved and kept with, their seminars were organized in addition to workshops, not relating to human rights as such, but the place was used as a landmark for the young people and for people in general. I think this is another means of memorialization. And after that, I wanted to underscore the importance of Salwa has just said regarding, and what has been underscored by the previous speakers, let's say the importance of these discussions with the young people, the youth who did not live despotism or the era of despotism and don't know what it is. They don't know the violation of human rights, gross human rights violations undergone by the past generations. And last speaker, or the latest speakers yesterday, said about the need to rewrite and reinterpret the memory. And of course, this is very important in the context of this issue of the writing of history and memory. An attempt, rewriting attempt, an attempt to new messaging about the real history. And from this point of view, all these elements are indeed very important, dynamic, but nevertheless, it is difficult to harmonize and it's difficult equally to reach a consensus. And therefore, we find to strike a balance between these different stakeholders, these different means, visions, and what history was and what the future could be. This is just food for thought that I wanted to express. Thank you. Thank you. And it is indeed a comment and important food for thought. If there are no other questions from the floor, I would like to give back the floor to our three speakers if they wish to to add anything or to make an additional comment before the end of this first panel. And I think before we start, Virginie, I asked Mrs. Piper a question to inform us about the exchange of opinion about the project and the consultancy about the project.
Is the question how people are responding to the project? I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't understand the question.
Virginie, can you ask your question again, please? You asked Piper a question.
Okay.
Your paper. Can you ask your question again, please?
Sure. Okay. Yes, no, so my question was to Piper about, if Piper, you could speak a little bit more about the community engagement aspect of your work and how you went about doing that, because I think that's something that's challenging everywhere. How you consult, who you consult with, what process you use to make it viable. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're unmuted, the host. I think someone's unmuted.
Thank you to the translators. Yeah, we're hearing you talking. If you don't mind muting so that we can hear Piper. Thank you so much.
So one of the things that we've done, well, first let's say there's so there's a lot of, so I'll say that before starting the Rikers Public Memory Project, I ran a initiative called Pastory Lab, which was about reckoning with the impact of incarceration nationally. And so that included participatory storytelling events that happened in communities across the country. We went to 13 cities. And in each of those cities, I would meet with people who were directly impacted by incarceration. Either they had been incarcerated themselves, or they had loved ones who were incarcerated. They had been kind of witness to the harm. And what we did was I would meet with this group of folks, usually 5 or 6 people who had committed to telling their stories. And I would do a training with them where, one of the things that I would talk about was the importance of really telling a story that that they felt like they were comfortable to tell, right? Telling the story that they owned. And so that meant really being reflective about, one, talking about, so what do you expect to happen when you tell this story? And what if you don't get what you want, right? Those were really important questions to ask. You're asking people to tell a story about the most painful thing that has ever happened to them, and to a public audience that includes elected officials, that includes prosecutors, that includes other state agents and community members. And people needed to be ready for the range of responses that they might get, and for the possibility that at the end of this, that they might not get what they want. And we wanted to make sure that we would not do more harm to them by asking them to share their testimony publicly in this way before they were ready. And so that was so those were the kind of conversations that I would have with people before each of our Story Lab events. And so we learned a lot from that project around how to prepare people to participate in the memory process that I've carried into the Rikers memory work. And so the Rikers memory work project, one of the things that was really helpful is that we had a funder, an independent funder, who gave us funds just to spend an entire year just doing planning, because we said we wanted to engage in a process that was participatory, that really centered the people who have been most harmed, and we needed a year to do that. That included, public forums around the city where more than 300 people helped us to reflect on the best ways to engage in this process. And we would ask them, 3 questions as a part of that. The 3 questions that's guided this project for us, which is, what should we remember about Rikers? How should we remember Rikers? And why should we remember Rikers? And they gave us so much great input into, how they thought it was important to, beyond just focusing on the building or the atrocities that happened there, that it was important to remember the people who had been disappeared, the people who had been harmed, the lives that have been lost. And so that has been the focus of our work, continuously, is to not so much focus on the building itself and what we can do on that land, but what we can do about the communities that have been affected. And they made it clear that public education was very key to this work, that the history of Rikers needed to be a people's history, that it needed to center the narratives of people who knew it, and that it also needed to be a catalyst for defining what justice would look like for those people. And so we've continued to incorporate them in the consultation throughout, beyond the planning phase. We have an advisory council that includes people who have been detained at Rikers. We have we hired a design team that really shared our values and our commitment to creating a participatory process. And they're right now in the early stages of designing the exhibit and including these sort of, open design workshops that always include formerly incarcerated people as a part of them. And so, throughout, we think it's very important to continuously take our lead from those who've been directly impacted.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether Virginie or Mariana wish to add anything before we adjourn this session.
Thank you. Not from my side. I think the main points were covered. I don't know if Mariana has anything to add.
I will be very quick in responding to some of the comments that were done in terms of the role of memory with young people and using prior spaces of detention or torture as spaces of memory, and the very challenging task of rewriting history and memory. These are processes that take time, and going back to what Piper was describing, the relevance of participation of those who were impacted by their families, because in many cases they are not here anymore, the victims of violence. These are processes that take time. Education and developing or rewriting the history, has a clear connection with education, whether this is part of formal education processes, but also of informal processes education, the process of education, even establishing agreements with schools or communities or activities that work with children in order to visit those spaces of memory, whatever these are, whether this is an exhibition or if are a formal museum or much more informal instances of memory. It doesn't matter, but giving also them the participation, the possibility of participate, but also of building that memory, because part of developing the story is also the imagination of the future. And I will go back to the role of access to the archives is key for the first kicking down the wall of silence, but also starting to reinterpret those facts in the view of what is now the present, but also in imagination of the future. Looking at those is absolutely key in order to be able to do all of those, to build proper spaces of memory and reconstructing history. I will leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for your time and the possibility to be here today with all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to the people who followed us and followed this session. I think now that we have a coffee break. I think this is a good link for the last session about the future of preserving the memory and the next steps to follow. I would like to call upon Mr. Ahmed Karoud to come to the podium to monitor the session, and I would like to call upon the speakers as well to join us here at the podium.
Thank you so much, Piper and Mariana. I guess it's our virtual coffee break now.
So we just left out now, or was
I think so. I think it's the virtual coffee break, and so now there'll be a break and then another panel. So you're welcome to join, to stay on for the rest of the program if possible. But
Floor to Ms. Farah Hashed to tell us about the need of the presence of a public policy concerning the memorialization.
Aslama, je vais faire mon intervention en français. Il n'y a pas de problème.
No problem. We have the interpretation. You have 15 minutes.
Aïe, ok. Donc, le sujet que qui m'a intéressé dans le cadre de ce panel, c'était la nécité d'une véritable politique publique mémorielle en Tunisie. Alors, je constate, enfin nous constatons tous une absence d'une véritable politique publique mémorielle en Tunisie. Nous constatons depuis 2011 des actions décousues. L'autorité publique, en fait, les autorités publiques agissent en électron libre. On peut dire, par exemple, je prends l'exemple de l'autorité publique qui est la présidence de la République. Tout récemment, le président
to France, and during an interview with France 24, France 24, spoke about colonization and said Tunisia was not colonized. It was not a colonization, it was a protectorate, which contradicts with what we have always learned, and which is the opposite of colonization of Tunisia. And before him, Beji Qaid Sibsi, in the framework of certain action, gave the Statute of Bourguiba it's the place of the revolution, and this was against the opinion of the large majority of the civil society. So as I said, our political acts are scattered. And before him, Mons Marzouki published a black book containing certain archives of the Presidency of the Republic with a tendency and to highlight certain memories other than others. So these are scattered action by the Presidency. But for this applies also to the public authorities in Tunisia. We see actions here and there. We don't really have a public policy, even a real political policy along this same line. And since 2011, we notice the presence of subcultures which are transmitted, and memorial subcultures which are transmitted in the families, in the social circles. We see the memorization emerging, and according to the personal influence and individual influence of each person or a group of person, the public authority is going to listen, to be tuned, and to carry a memorial action, or will not do it according, of course, to the influence it is subjected to. And what we need is a true policy, a public memorial policy. So this fragmentation continues even after even after the Truth and Dignity Commission, even after the report of the TDC plutôt. I would like to insist when I speak about the absence of memorial public policy, I'm not talking about the period, the period covered by the law on transitional justice, but it goes beyond this. It equally concerns the colonial period, and it concerns the area beyond that, because public memorial policy must take into consideration the global memory of the nation. This is the first remark I wish to make. What we equally can notice is that before 2011 there was memorial policy, or what we can call memorial strategic policy, which means it has implemented an official history with a certain abuse of memory. It's an official history which is at the same time partial, and it's going to elude certain elements, and it is partial because it's going to highlight certain options or certain selections to highlight and to underscore and to promote certain people and certain actions only. This was before 2011, and in the framework of transitional justice and the guarantee of non-recurrence, I mean, the aim is again is not to go back to this very situation which prevailed before 2011. The challenge that we encounter is that today there is a challenge in the framework of a true democracy. The state necessarily has less power with regard to the memorial policy, and therefore it has to interact with other actors which are not state-owned, even actors who are private. And as a matter of fact, we can say that they have to interact with what we call in literature what we call the memory entrepreneurs. This is not something pejorative. The memory entrepreneurs are the ones who act, and work on the memory. It could be the victim themselves, or it could be private actors, it could be civil society organizations, and it could be also the benefit-making companies, such as the companies of communication, etc. This is rather a comprehensive, inclusive phenomenon that we can observe throughout the world, especially in democratic systems and regimes. What we notice nowadays. What do we mean by having a memorial policy? First of all, this means public policy. A public policy, according to the definition of the Public Administration Dictionary, these are specific actions which are interrelated, and I would like to underscore the word interrelated, and therefore they are not scattered, as I said in the beginning, or not related, as I said in the beginning. They are official acts which are carried out within an enterprise by certain authority, legitimate authorities, and which seek to resolve a public problem, to solve a public problem. So interrelated and not scattered, disconnected activities, but they must be legitimate because the public authorities have the necessary instruments to regulate the different memories, and in order to impose certain memorial line and to channel. But we can ask why we need a public policy, memorial political policy. Will not be there a memory abuse again? This is a question one might rightly ask. Why solve a problem? And it's not really a problem. It's something in the framework of the memory which seeks to meet the needs of people and to actually provide reparation for the victims and their offsprings, and to avoid future violations. At the same time, it guarantees the absence or the non-recurrence of this violation. This public memory or policy, memorial policy, this is why we need this memorial policy, why it is necessary. At the same time, it is important to know that the law on transitional justice compels the state, it does not really oblige the state to follow public policies. It does not go into the detail on how the state must act in order to preserve the memory, but this involves public policies undoubtedly and necessarily. And the ultimate goal is to preserve the memory and to guarantee the non-recurrence of these violations. In order to meet these goals, reparations for the victims and their offsprings, and to guarantee the non-recurrence, we achieve a result, a tangible result with these policies. The result is to create an official public memory. I have a document which is, just give me 1 second to sort my paper out and to make sure it is the right document. The first result is to come out with an official public policy. A public official policy, memory policy, means a memory which gives certain homogeneity to the different representations and which tries to impact and to have an influence on the various actors who are concerned. As a matter of fact, it impacts the actors, the stakeholders, to have a certain representation of the collective memory, and this involves the victims, and of course the ultimate goal also is to avoid the non-recurrence of these violations. The first question that we might rightly ask about the public memory policy is how to avoid memory abuse. I think that the democratic mechanisms and the mechanisms of transitional justice, now we are talking about the era since 1955, it is evidently necessary that the public authorities must base their work and their investigative work and must try to achieve results. The public authorities cannot impose by itself an official memory to the public without basing its work on this work which was carried out with the victims and the various stakeholders. And of course, this will actually spare us the spoiling or the abuse of memory. This is for the period starting 1955. For the period before 1955, let's say the colonial era, it seems to me that it is extremely important to implement tools and mechanisms for a transitional justice of the colonialization period. Today, we many decades after, there is part of the memory which is confiscated. Archives, this means archives to which we don't have access, studies, So how can we solve this problem? Maybe we need to implement a joint committee, French-Tunisian committee, which will have full access to the archives filed in Tunisia and in France to make sure to have the transitional justice and to acknowledge the victims, and so the moral reparation can be done towards the victims or their the descendants or offsprings. This is very important in the framework of this, what we call official memory, this public memorial policy. But as I said, the goal is to avoid the non-recurrence of this violation. It means it's an acknowledgement, it's a moral reparation. But is this moral reparation sufficient? No, it is not sufficient. It's not sufficient. Why? Because there will be always other memories. We cannot impose an official memory. It will always exist. It will be always there. It will have a certain visibility. It will allow maybe something. There will be less violence perpetrated. There will be a sort of consensus because processes have been followed, a consensus on transitional justice has been followed, but at the same time there will be the individual memory and the memory of individual groups and subgroups, competitive memories, and which will question this official memory. This is only natural and normal and should be accepted. It's not a problem in itself. We cannot eliminate in democracies or democratic regimes, you cannot delete them. But on the opposite, they are good to have, because when examining the works of Sandrine Lefranc and others, we see that in fact an official memory cannot by itself guarantee the non-recurrence, and it will be good to have other types of memories, certain dynamics of a true dynamics involving different social networks on the internet, but social networks also, whether on the internet or on other tools, and to have other social spheres. It's the existence of these spheres which guarantee the non-recurrence, because if we try to preserve your own individual memory, somewhere we accept we acknowledge the memorial process, and therefore we respect memorial process and ours and those of others. With this dynamic approach, we can ensure the and guarantee the non-recurrence. That is why a true public memorial policy will not lead only to an official memory, but I think the main goal and the ultimate goal should be to create an enabling environment, a propitious environment for all memories. And this free expression is a principle which goes beyond this official memory. It is their free expression which is important in itself. And what does this mean? What do we mean by creating an enabling environment? Setting up a support policy by the public authorities to help the memorial, the memorial project. Of course, this involves the official memory, but parallel memories and even memories which are competitive. This is not a concern. On the opposite, this will trigger a certain debate and will have a critical-based approach. This is the first thing. The second thing consists in the primordial role of what we call the memory entrepreneurs, a word which is more and more used when we speak about transitional justice, and the aim is to help and support all the approaches, working about the memories, whether we are talking about non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, individuals, groups and subgroups, and so on and so forth. This is the leading principle, the memorialization principle, which in the long term will generate all these horizons that seek to preserve the memory and reach the main goal, which is the non-recurrence of violations. And by way of conclusion, I would like to say, that there are static aspects of public memorial policy which was engraved in the official memory and engraved in the museums, memorials. These static actions also are concern equally the archives, access to the archives, and so on and so forth. But it will concern equally reviewing the education programs. These are, you need to build static memory, but at the same time you need static evolving memory, making memory something alive by some elements involving the victims themselves. This equally involves cultural events, access to the archives. So this equally involves the national educational programs. It's not enough to set up an official program and unique program and tell the people this is our history, this is our memory, and that's it. No, I think that the approach must be the dynamic to enable the pupils to debate these memorial issues, and this is what's going to deeply root the notion of the preservation of the memory and to avoid and guarantee non-recurrence. And my last sentence will be in order to have a true public policy, memorial policy, we must have a public policy which must meet basic criteria. It must be the role of an authority, maybe a Ministry for Human Rights, similar ministry, similar to the Ministry of Human Rights, whose duty would be to define accurately the institutions concerned, the stakeholders, its main goals in a very accurate and clear way, its resources, and it goes without saying, its method of assessment, true assessment of the public policy which will be implemented. With that, I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Farah, for this valuable presentation on the need to draft a public policy for remembrance and memorialization. We shall discuss all of these important ideas with Professor Karim Abdeslam, the President of the Justice and Rehabilitation Association. I thank the organizers for this valuable opportunity to express ourselves on this important topic, and thanks to Professor Ahmed. Usually I do not embark on personal introduction, but I will make an exception. And my name is Karim Abdeslam, a former political prisoner, and among the first associations of justice and rehabilitation that advocated the principle of transitional justice as one of the institutional and structural associations for the management of transition to democracy. The association was one of the voices of the victims. I'm the author of a book, Pain and Suffering, that depicted the story of the victims, classifying them ideologically and politically and historically and geographically, and this was adopted later by TDC in the final, in its final report, adopting the same classification. It was an attempt to really narrate and provide the verbal memory. I'm also there's also a poem about the gross human rights violations perpetrated against those arrested. I'm also the author of a procedural manual for the dispute management among the victims, and therefore we needed a procedural management or manual. I'm also working on a project with the UN development program on a project called When the Injury Depicts the Ordeal. It's an attempt to bring victims together in order to advocate their own interests. I'm also the owner of a project called Mental Tranquility, an attempt to heal the wounds and to use the injuries optimally. I also published my testimony as a victim and that I submitted to the large audience for the sake of recognition. I was also a victim and an executioner, and I also took part in the culture of acknowledgement because I consider that to be significantly important. I'm a member of the guiding association of Northern Africa for remembrance and memorialization. And last but not least, I'm a co-founding member for the establishment of the National Coalition for Innovas for the Victims. I'm honored to represent it. It is working. I know that I have a colleague of mine who talked on behalf of the victims, and what really pleased me when I heard my colleague from the Office of the Human Rights of the High Commission of Human Rights speak about it, with due respect to your work and to its content, but we are still at the end of the project. When we speak about remembrance, we are just addressed as service beneficiaries and not real actors, but the victims could be also real stakeholders and full-fledged stakeholders in the process. It's all about the whole background of people, and therefore we need to address its ethical and humanitarian and emotional dimension. So far, we cannot address the issue of remembrance in psychological remembrance is to call upon a momentum, a moment that is really tainted with a lot of emotions and covered in emotions. Remembrance and memorialization is a weapon. It's a healing process, and it is a guarantee for non-recurrence and to avoid setbacks. And therefore, delving into technicalities and putting the victims at the tail of the activities, this is not a way of considering the victims as full-fledged, really, stakeholders. Memorialization is not remembering, is not similar to any other remembrance or any. Like a fingerprint, it cannot be assimilated to any other experience. When it comes to violations, each victim has its way of storing and dealing with the intake of that suffering, and therefore we cannot compare one memory to another experience of memory. Its expression is linked and connected to our cultural heritage, and therefore I always reiterate that we need to give priority to those who have opinions to express. It's all about their lives and not about archives or documents. If we consider that, remembrance is part of the truth that we have not uncovered so far, we are talking about it as if a system that was unseated. We are at the core of a system that is still there in terms of the practices and the violations and the threats that the victims are sustaining so far. And there are, until today, inhumane practices targeting the victims, when in fact we are talking about an advanced stage of a formal establishment that is devoid of any content, because delving into the legal matters cannot really express the facts as they are. So where do the victims stand? And this is a question that I ask to all the organizers. What role shall we grant to the victims? Shall we just receive all of these consultations and then express our opinions? the truth that has not been yet established, what happened, where, when, and by whom, and how and why. These 5 WH questions to really understand and unveil the truth. I would advocate a philosophical statement. Knowing the truth and producing the truth discourse. When we speak about memorialization and memory, we need to produce. Heidegger identifies the truth. The truth is an interrelation between a rule and the power. We cannot dissociate or disconnect the truth from authority or power. Michel Foucault explains it even further when he says that the truth truth cannot be disconnected from the education work produced by the authority and that is disseminated in public. And therefore, the authority is imposing its hegemony through these mechanisms of discourse. And therefore, we are trying to produce a different authority with the same tools and mechanisms. This is a clear lesson when Marx said we cannot produce a new system with the tools of a former regime. You want to adapt our memory using the old and ancient tools used by the former regime, a picture devoid of any content and totally disconnected with the stakeholders. We have more than 2,000. We have thousands of victims that are acknowledged by TDC and that have no protection in terms of certain projects. That's why I call upon everyone to review our approach to involve really the victims effectively. It's all about the lives of people, and this has nothing to do with archival documents. I'm not really interested in reproducing institutions about memory. I want a discourse that is respectful of the people, of the victims, between the content, the substance, and the structure and the law. There's a huge gap, so we need to really paddle back and to reconcile between the content. When we talk about change, the invitation of the victims to the process of transition, just because they constitute the conscience of this change, and they cannot be used as just service beneficiaries, that they should be invited just when they are needed. They are also holders of opinions, and we have to leave that box and the square of service beneficiaries, especially when it comes to their daily lives, because these pictures constitute the lives of generations. They are not archival documents that can be, addressed institutionally and legally. This is all about emotional charges loaded with suffering and pains and the processes that involve people who disappeared, who were killed. And so far we are seeking truth about those, the perpetrators, for accountability. So the truth cannot be established without providing rehabilitation for the victims. We need to guarantee non-recurrence of these violations. We can respect all the different expressions through art and different means. Everyone can address the issue from any whichever approach, but we have to respect our memory, without really any demeaning approach. We want our simple memory as it is, expressive of our selves, our past life, and that is still casting its shadows until now. I'd like to conclude by saying that memory is a weapon that could be used against the victims, a double-edged sword, and as one of the speakers referred to some leaking the archives, and the archives are stored in areas that are unknown. and that there are really litigation and dispute between different institutions, and that the political authority is not able to really provide the truth in its narrative fashion. What happened so far, we have not reached that stage, and therefore we need to paddle back in order to understand the truth. And the truth is the cornerstone upon which we have to build all of our approaches. Once we establish the truth and we rehabilitated those who have sustained all of these violations. This morning we were in a press conference about the coalition of the victims claiming or requesting a public apology. We are still claiming the state's recognition of all the violations perpetrated during these 60 years. We cannot skip this topic and speak about institutions and experiences and programs without really understanding and getting to know this memory. We are still struggling with the cases of enforced disappearance. The case of Matmati is still, shrouded with, ambiguity, and nothing has really been established about the fate of the executioners who have perpetrated all acts that were prohibited by human rights laws. And we are, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Karim Abdeslam, for this important testimony that focused on a lot of messages regarding the suffering and the plights of the victims. With Mr. Rida Barakati, we will listen to a different and equally important experience about memory and loyalty. Thank you. First of all, at this particular time, I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers of this seminar. They are the International Center for Transition Justice, the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, and the United Nations Development Fund, and the German cooperation organization. I'd like to clarify that these persons are entitled, and it is their duty to react and to plan and to discuss and to organize seminars regarding issues of transitional justice. Why? In a nutshell, I will refer to just one argument. Any issue pertaining to human rights at any area of the planet is a universal issue that is of interest to all mankind. And therefore, there is no issue pertaining to human rights in a given country and that concerns just the people of that country, rejecting any foreign interference. This idea, coincides with what Ben Ali used to accuse us with, that we are dealing with the foreign parties and that this is treason through collaboration with foreigners. The second tribute, usually I don't really thank, my second tribute is to all those who intervened during these 2 days. Why do I thank them? For an important point that I will mention. I tried to make sense of all the points they have raised in different areas, and I'd like to sum them up in 2 points. The first point is the technical issues pertaining to legislation, archiving, and the archivists, and the right to access information. All of these technical issues, in my opinion, are important and essential because they constitute the starting point to rewrite history anew and to commemorate and revive the memory. In the absence of these different sources, we cannot speak about collective memory or special memory, or to think about transition from despotism to democracy and to build a new society. These aspects are the guarantors of this transition. The second point is about the significance, the values, the principles that refer to these technical issues, and they are the guarantee for non-recurrence to the past violations and to rewrite the history through a new education of society. At this level particularly, I felt reassured when certain items were referred, the rewriting of history, and there was a reference to national memory and local experiences, because remembrance from the national standpoint, and I really concur with what Farah Hashed said. There was reference to the national memory, and there are specific local memories. Memory should not be really officially boxed. It goes beyond that constraint. Collective memory is multidimensional, and it has the subjective and humanitarian dimension, but despite that, it does not go beyond the general system regarding the gross past human rights violations and our aspirations for a new society governed by democratic ties and due compliance with human rights. I'm very happy with this experience and with these arguments, because I found myself and the association that I represent, Fair Loyalty, which is the Association for the Revolutions Marty Nabil Barakati, and the association's name is Memory of Loyalty, finds itself with its name and with its objectives set out in the bylaws and the organic law and the official gazette. So we are a memory and loyalty in order to move on to a new society. And memory is not a technical matter. Memory in the organic law, we will endeavor to contribute to really promote the memory of Nabil Barakati, who was tortured and tortured to death in all of the living forces back then in Tunisia, with all the representatives of the civil society, would come to Gafour to commemorate since 87 until this day, until the revolution date. Our association is a continuation of this memory. In the organic law, we want to promote this memory, turning it into a multi-activity festival to develop and disseminate the principles that the martyr believed in and for which he had struggled and died. And these are the very same values of the revolution: human dignity, justice, and along to these points, to contribute to the dissemination of the principles of human rights and to counter torture. This is our association, of course, Memory and Loyalty, and in the time allotted to me, I will now show a video footage to really show you our declared project's idea regarding transitional justice. The first point is the will. The second one is the recommendations. The will and
قدمت له الأستاذة المطلب وقالت له هذا عضو مؤسس في الجمعية وفي نفس الوقت هو أخوه. خذيت أنا الكلمة بعد ما تكلموا الكل وقلت له راهو الوالدة راهو تدمرنا وكذا، وبالمختصر المفيد راهو الوالدة معناها كانت لما يجوها من غير ما نسمي كلهم حاضرين والغايبين راهي تسعد وفرحانة ياسر باليوم الوطني من هذا التعذيب، وقتاش يولي رسمي وقتاش يولي في وسائل الإعلام وفي الدور الثقافة ودور الشباب وهكذا، باش الوصية نتاعها هي لما سألوها شنو الطالبة، معروفة جملة الوالدة، انت أي واحد يسأل شنو الطالبة تقول له أنا نطلب من ربي باش حتى أم تونسية ما عادش تذوق الليعة هذه، وباش نوصلوا لهذه باليوم الوطني لمهار التعذيب وبالتثقيف ضد التعذيب وبالتربية. فعلمت الرئيس، ويبدو أنه في السنة هذه في الموقع بتاع الرئاسة موجود أنه الرئيس وافق على 8 ماي يوم وطني لمهار التعذيب، استقبل الأستاذة راضية وأعلن عن موافقته كذا. كان حادثة بسيطة في يوم من الأيام حكيت هي الوالدة في الكلام نقول لكم فيه مع مجموعة اللي جاوها وخرجوا، فما شاب بقى معها في الدار قال لها بصراحة حاجة تو أنت جد عليك باش يجي نهار ويتنحى التعذيب والنظام هذا ما عادش يعذب، هو قتل نبيل هو حمل همي ما جاش، هو ياكل في العصا تو مهارب ولا في الحبس، وهم قتلوا فلان الفلاني الاخر، وهم في العبد كيفاه قال لهم ما جد عليك انت؟ قالت له اقعد عايش ولدي، قالت له انت صغير، اما راه في الخمسينات وفي الستينات كانت الاطفال نتاعنا اولادنا يقروا عند المدب، وعند المدب ياكلوا الفلقه على رجليهم، من بعد جات المدرسه ولو يقروا في المدرسه عند المعلم، والمعلم راه عنده عصا، اما راه اقل بالمدب، خير من المدب يضرب برفق وكذا. قالت له المدرسه تطورت، توا شكون المعلم اللي يضرب؟ فما حتى. قالت له يجي نهار بالثقافه بالربايه بالناس هذوما اللي كانوا هنا، قالت له الناس هذوما اللي كانوا هنا التوانسه الباهين.
These people who are here, the good Tunisian people, these people of defending human rights, people who endure the burden, the political burden, men and women alike, and the women, the democratic women organization, the unionists, and so on and so on and so forth. You know, so many things, positive things happened and must be narrated in these events. But unfortunately, there is no room here. For example, before the death of the poet Ahmed, and somebody told him, "I'm the brother of the martyr," and he told him, "I do know you. I know him, and I know his children, and I know his mother, and I had the honor of writing a poet in the presence of the mother of the martyr." So, the National Day against torture, or to condemn torture in Tunisia, is something defended by all political tendencies and by all political and unions. It's something requested by all parties, by our NGOs and the free people of Tunisians against torture. So what we are asking is that no mother will suffer again. We are hoping that Nabil would be the first and the last victim of this torture. Sorry, we can't hear the speaker. You know, I was with Badruddin Rgei, who died under torture in Megrine. I was equally with Hishri in city Tadaman and other people. So, on my behalf, on behalf of the family, I hope that the Commission takes this recommendation and include them in their recommendations. Actually, we actually cling to this demand to make of the 8th of May the day against torture. And you know, even the past presidency agreed about this request, and the current presidency also accepted to make the 8th of May day against to condemn torture. And thanks to your efforts and the efforts of people who set up you know, a tradition and a culture to condemn torture, we hope that this will be implemented. The second thing I wish to express, unfortunately the sound is on and off. I think it's the network. C'est le réseau. We're not asking for a road or to be named after my brother. You know, the cultural center in Gafour was burned down. It was built by the French and the Italians. The transitional justice took place, and fascism and Nazism was liquidated in Germany and in Italy. So what we'd like is to have this headquarters of the 9th of April prison, both of them become a museum of the tortures. And we had the meetings with Radia, and you know, nothing was documented, and we are requesting that the Gafour Center, and we are asking this urgently, would like to make of it a museum against torture, and a sphere in an area, so that the victim, the Association of the Martyrs, has its quarters there. And I was going to talk about Nabil, and you know, the family wrote thousands of books about him. So we'd like again to change the center into a library as well. You know, we have some religious books belonging to my late grandfather, and we would like to donate them to this library. And we have also some Lebanese books because whoever who wrote the national anthem, you know, included this great lady, and she married labor unionists, and then she came to Tunis and settled in Gafour. Gafour, you know, in the voice goes on and off. Unfortunately, we can't hear him clearly. Some people accuse us and say, "Oh, your children is a communist," and say, "Yes, so what? He's a communist, and we are proud of it. We know that communism is something good, and like people, and that is against exploitation." And I'm saying this to honor the soul of Nabil, who opted for this policy. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that the Shahid Association and the experience that we lived is, you know, is now clear. What you are requesting is very clear. I just want, you know, so by way of conclusion, I would like to express that I like very much what Ms. Elodie said about the local aspects and about you know, the monuments, and these monuments must be active and vivid, must include activities, and they shouldn't be something just sites that we visit like you know, rigid mummies. I feel at ease because I interact positively with all the experiences that you told us about during these last 2 days in Peru and in the Philippines and in other countries. The countries that have been mentioned in the papers by Virginia, Pamela, and others, and Roland. Would like to thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, and apologies for taking too much time. I took 20 minutes, 90 minutes, and then thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Rida, for this testimony. And so these 3 papers are very important, and their importance lie in the fact that they fling the door for the future. Mrs. Farah spoke about the need and the importance to design and to engineer a policy, a public policy for memorialization, because many people worked on the memory, and I think she did well when she reminded us that during every stage of our political history, and the same thing applies to other countries, there is what we call a public memorization policy. Maybe they can take another name, but it suffices us to remember together how for about 30 years ideas have been drafted and inculcated upon the young people. So we had the different titles. They were called National Celebration Days, and these National Celebration Days of this public policy created a public policy for the memory. And therefore, today, if you ask children who were born in 1955 until 1987, you will see that they have a view of history. It is the 1st of June, it is the 20th of March, it is 3rd of August. These are the titles, these are the things that the young people remember, or these people remember. And this is not by pure chance, but it was better channeled, and it seeks to disseminate the certain vision, a certain approach, history, an official approach to history. I would like to remind you that during the latest months, when social movements took place in the US under a big title, Black Lives Matters, what this led to, one of the phenomenon that resulted from this is that many people in the cities went to some monuments and destroyed them or tumbled them down. Christophe Colomb statue was tumbled down, and you know he's a great man, and the whole world speak about him as the discoverer of the new world. So this is an official view, and we have a public view about the memory. At a certain time in 2020, and people have actually uprooted these symbols. Why did I give you these 2 examples? Because from what Dr. Farah said, it is urgent, and there is an urgent need to work on the elaboration of public policy of memory. And all the experiences that have been mentioned yesterday and today give us models and help us on how to build and construct this public memorialization policy. It is done in consultation with other people. It's done with a true participatory approach to make sure that whoever is concerned with the memory in the societies becomes involved and doesn't feel like he is outside the scope, outside the landscape. He is only brought in as they would bring in, you know, for example, in the past, of African people they were brought to France in a museum to show what a primitive person is. The victim is part and parcel, must be part and parcel of the public policy. These are general comments that I wanted to make. We listened to two experiences from different schools, but this gives you the feeling of hurt that they feel. If there is no memorization, and the title of this memorization is very important. You know, the aim, the ultimate goal is non-recurrence. Memorialization seeks to avoid the recurrence of the violation. If you look at the city of Gafour, and you know, and 8th of May, and the police station become interrelated. It's related to something dirty, which is torture. So the policeman, the teacher, everybody becomes something bad. Torture is something that must not be accepted, that must be completely rejected and totally rejected. And as Karim said, when he spoke about Kamal Matmati and the celebration, how this was killed, and testimonies were given at court and in Gebes, but so far we cannot find the body of this person who died due to torture. If you have any question or comments on the Facebook, or if the floor here has any question, please feel free to ask for queries or to ask questions or to make clarification. The floor is yours. Mr. Rafiq Amran, our comrade, thank you very much. Memory is undoubtedly very important. Public memory is very important. It's very important because it will be the result of several opinions and recommendations, and thus all groups will be involved. I think that public memory, unfortunately, is missing something, is not complete, and it could be a proof that the transitional justice is stumbling. Let me give you an example, because in my capacity of a member of an association, a local association in Nabil, at a certain time in 2015, we tried on the occasion and when celebrating what happened in 2014, be it the Intifada or Thawra, as you may call it, we tried to embody that and to speak about that with the children in schools. The 14th of January is a holiday, but we invited several pupils in a given school, and then we asked them what they thought about 2014 and what it represents for them. And of course, we had the pupils from different classes, and I was really surprised. I was surprised that shocked that they did not know what the 14th of May, the 14th of January means, or what was the reason for that. And actually, the moderator did not have the capacity to channel or orient them and to moderate them very well, but that's another topic. But his goal was to prepare them for municipality elections. You know, the children's municipality or the municipality council for children. So I mean, this leads me to talk about what follows. My question is, do similar seminars and additional meetings, and I think they must be brought down to the level of understanding of children and the young, and we must try to overcome whoever tried to weaken the acquisitions that we have had thanks to the revolution of the 14th of January. The 14th of January is a process that must be evolved and move ahead by implementing transitional justice and by the dissemination amongst the children of this event, of this revolution. The goal is to help them know that although we have been educated and inculcated certain ideas under, you know, 3rd of August, 20th of March, and this and that, etc. 18th of January is the, etc. But at the same time, the 14th of January must, in the children's mind, must constitute and represent the different history and the starting point for history. And this is the work of the NGOs. But unfortunately, these NGOs are encountering some difficulties, and most of the time they are imprisoned or entangled in the political disputes, and each time they face a stumbling block that hinders and impedes the implementation of the democratic opinions and the opinions of transitional justice.
Thank you, Professor Amran. Professor Karim, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. Just to sum up the issue, apart from having the memory as official produces the official discourse. I advocate the diverse and the different culture of memories that is based on alternative memories. The official framework is usually associated with the authority. I advocate the neo-culture that refers to all stakeholders, that is interactive with the victims themselves, in order to create a new awareness of non-repetition or non-recurrence. Yes, Professor Farah. Just to answer Mr. Karim and Professor, the general policy of memory is not public memory. It's not the same thing. Public remembrance is created within society and by society gradually and progressively. It's not the state that creates public memory. It's this general and the public policy resembles any other general or public policy in health. There has to be a public policy. That's why I'd like to answer Karim. This public policy has to be there, because whether we like it or not, it has to be a public policy. It has to be integrated with interactive actions, as I started my paper. There are disconnected actions, but we have to adopt certain names. Whether we like it or not, there will be memorials, there will be commemorations. The school programs are there. We cannot say that the National Educational Ministry has programs and there are history programs that will be taught. Who will prepare those programs and school curricula? It's not just the state alone that will devise these programs. These programs have to be done in association with other stakeholders. This is what I insisted upon in my paper. The state alone cannot, within the framework of democracy, create its own policy. Otherwise, we'll be paddling backwards. And therefore, we no longer have memory, we have official history. That's why there's a huge difference between official history and public policy. A public policy has objectives. We know who the stakeholders are, who the partners are, how we assess each part. Otherwise, if we don't use all the stakeholders, if we don't do the evaluation, if we don't deal with the victims, if that happens within the framework of a single person, or because that person is well connected or has a connection in the ministry, they will give the name of his father or grandfather. Of course, we might find things that we don't expect, things that do not that are not consistent with transitional justice. But this will not guarantee non-repetition. I think that we have to come to grips with the fact that the state has obligations to fulfill. Secondly, when we speak about public authorities, I'm not referring to the national authorities. Local and national authorities, it's public authorities in general, local governments and so forth. But we have to have local public authorities because they will do it their way, of course. This is my reply, and I think that we have to really accept this fact. Thank you, Professor Farah, for these clarifications. Any other comments? Thank you. It's just a comment rather than a question. It seems to me that the future process through which the government has to devise an action plan in accordance with the TDC report could be an opportunity to provide a structural framework for a discussion that has to be inclusive, and in view of the richness of the debate that we have had during these 2 days in terms of the mandate of TDC, and that we have to have a multitude of actors in order to proceed with the judicial reforms. There are philosophical, social, and cultural issues that are on the agenda, and some of these discussions have to be continued in view of their complexity, but over the next years. And I think that the process for the development of this action plan for the implementation of these recommendations would require that we focus on certain issues and certain large-scale inclusive discussions in order to move the debate forward and to lay the foundation for a concretization of what we are talking about, a consecration actually of what we are talking about. One thing that we are working on in our advocacy regarding these issues, this action plan has to be inclusive and participatory, with collaboration with ministries and other partners, and it has to result in achieve concrete results in view, of course, with the budgets. We need to plan the resources to ensure that these issues could lead to concrete achievements. We have had interesting examples yesterday regarding this architectural project that was developed in the Philippines. We need resources to really implement a project. There will be a lot of other initiatives. This has to be really done in consultation, and this action plan that we have within the High Commission, along with our partners, could be another opportunity to start more structured discussions addressing the philosophical dimensions as well. These discussions will really play out over many years, as was the case in Argentina or South Africa, just to mention these two examples, and the Philippines also, as the regime was instated a long time ago. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very short because we are nearing the conclusion of this seminar. Just 3 points. The first issue, the importance of the topic that we try to address during this seminar, remembrance and memory. This is why the special rapporteur, whose paper we introduced, thought about the final report that we included in the file, to what extent we can consider the importance of memory, and this could be the fifth pillar among the mechanisms of transitional justice. The second point, and I concur with Mrs. Farah Hashed when she said that there are, in general, there's an obligation incumbent upon the state, and this is among the recommendations in the final report of the Truth and Dignity Commission, that includes topics with reference to the preservation of memory. And therefore, the state, out of its constitutional and legal obligations and commitments, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And when we speak about preservation of memory, we are referring to several memories, because we have a multitude of memories, and as Mr. Karim Abdeslam, each individual, even within the single violation, we could find different feelings and emotions and really interpretation and different ways of narrating these ordeals. And of course, mercy lies within this difference. Another point, there are different levels for memorialization. The first level, at the level of the state, the need, and this is among the recommendations, the final report of TDC, to review history or the teaching of history. Because when we go back, and based on the reports available, a large portion, as you said earlier, we need to disseminate the issues pertaining to memorialization for children at the level of universities and researchers. A large portion of the learning people receive through the courses they learn through history. That's why we need to review the educational curricula. There are several surveys that establish that in the previous period, between 1955 up to 2011, there's focus on specific individuals that the former regime considered as the leaders of the national movement. There's preference to people at the detriment of others. But when you study history, you find out that there are other individuals that contributed to the independence of the country and who have reinforced the liberation movement in Tunisia. That's why we need to reconsider the second level, which is apart from the role of the state, and that doesn't cost anything. In the sense that apology on behalf of the state would not cost the state anything. On behalf of the past violations, the proclamation of a national day to counter torture would not cost the state anything. To set up memorials in specific symbolic and emblematic areas for the preservation of memory would not cost the state a dime, and therefore the Darfur Center, where there was a given violation or a certain governmental office, these are beacons that are symbolized by specific events during the revolution or after the revolution. The area where we had the 9th of April prison that could be turned into a center for memory. There were requests for the Ministry of the Interior where there were huge past violations that this office should be turned into a center for memorialization, and that would come under the framework of institutional reform in order to change certain ideas about certain institutions. Now, the preservation of memory is about anything that can be done by those, by everyone, because the organizers of the seminar cannot be a substitute for the state or the civil society. They are supporters of what the state and the civil society can do in this regard. Be it at the local or national levels. To what extent the associations in the governorates, in the regions, to what extent they can really preserve memory. Unfortunately, 10 years on after the revolution, there's a lot of this memory unless it is documented and preserved. If we don't prepare specific and well-designed repositories, we might lose those memories today. For instance, for the record, you have a street bearing the name of an individual. That name will preserve that history. We may focus on political personalities for political achievements. That's why I concur with Professor Hashed. The state is bound to really do that because it has the capacity to do that. We could also create the prison literature. Any advertisement, any cartoons, or any artistic activities could also build for the perpetuation of memory. And that's a way of perpetuating memory. To conclude, there's a guarantee for non-recurrence. That was part of the title of the seminar. Beacon in the transitional justice process in Tunisia is the public hearing sessions. The first were in 17th and 18th of November 2017. It was a landmark event that was broadcast on all TV channels and audiovisual channels. People were shocked. People had never realized the extent of the violations. So when they listened and watched, they started to understand and come to grips with the memory of the past violations. That's why it is important. It's not just for reprisals or for revengeful purposes, but the real purpose is that the first gain from these public auditions is to rehabilitate the victims. And I concur with Abdelkarim Abdeslam. Any support given to the victims, and this is, I'm sure, the intention of the organizers and the civil society. The first purpose is to rehabilitate these victims, and Mr. Karim Abdeslam is right in saying that when you, it's important to rehabilitate these victims, and there's also a part pertaining to accountability and truth-seeking, but most importantly, to ensure that such violations do not happen again. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for this useful summary for the future and for the organizers. Quite certainly, this is just an episode that will usher and lead to new sites and work sites with regards to the public policy regarding memory and the role of the stakeholders, the state, the civil society, the victims, and research institutions. This will be the topic of one or several future seminars that will ensure the same success as this seminar. I thank you all for your participation, and we shall meet in other seminars in the near future. Thank you all. I would like to thank all the speakers. We have come to the conclusion of this seminar. I'd like to thank everyone, the speakers of yesterday and today's speakers, because we as organizers, we benefited a great deal from the speakers' feedback, from the different perspectives expressed. This can only be enriching and important, and an additional stimulus and motivation to work harder and more and further on assisting the civil society in Tunisia, the victims and the Tunisian state in, of course, fulfilling their obligations towards transitional justice in a loyal fashion as per the expectations of the victims and as per the endeavor of the civil society in Tunisia. As a representative of ICTJ, I'd like to thank our partners, the Office of the Human Rights, the High Commission for Human Rights, the United Nations Development Program. My thanks also go out to all the interpreters and the technicians who have done a good job in ensuring due progress and due accomplishment of our seminar. I see you, God willing, in next seminars in the future. Thank you.